Welcome and good morning or good afternoon or good evening from wherever you are in the world. My name is Andrew Metrick. I'm the director of the Yale program on financial stability and a professor at the Yale School of Management. And I'm delighted today that we're able to host a book talk with Charles Goodhart and Manoj Pradhan on their new, very interesting book, The Great Demographic Reversal. And today's talk will be moderated by Peter Conti-Brown, who is joining us from sunny Philadelphia there in his background. And Peter is an assistant professor of legal studies law at the University of Pennsylvania, and somebody who is one of the world's foremost scholars of the Federal Reserve, the author of a book, Power and Independence of the Federal Reserve, and several forthcoming books and many influential articles in this space. While he is not currently under our umbrella here at the Yale Program on Financial Stability, we are always trying to get him to participate in our events and try to suck him into our orbit. So I'm delighted that today he is willing to moderate this book talk on this very interesting topic. So I'm going to turn it over to Peter, who can introduce the authors and lead the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and thanks to the Yale Program on Financial Stability for hosting this wonderful book talk. I'm delighted to introduce Charles Goodhart and Manoj Pradhan. Charles is one of the most legendary and most influential macroeconomists of several generations, and so it is a delight to have his perspective on both the theory, practice, and history of central banking, of macroeconomics, and macro trends. He's joined with his co-author, Manoj Pradhan. Manoj works at Talking Heads Macro. He has also previously worked as managing director at Morgan Stanley and on the faculty of George Washington University and State University of New York. Their book is The Great Demographic Reversal, Aging Societies, Waning Inequality, and an Inflation Revival. And their book, as they will describe it, stands against a thesis about long-term secular trends in interest rates and the macroeconomy, relevant to each of us. These trends include questions as fundamental as what it is that central banks are doing when they confront trade-offs or not between employment, inflation, and financial stability. The way that we will approach today's talk is that Charles and Manoj will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes. I will then keep a queue on the Q&A. I encourage everyone to be as active as possible. I'll lead with the first question, and then we'll turn it over to all of you with questions that I will take again in the Q&A. And with that, I turn the time over to Charles and Manoj.
Thank you very much, Peter. My only slight worry is that the word legendary usually implies you're well past it. Anyhow, the great moderation that occurred between the early 1990s and 2007 until the great financial crisis hit was one of the best times that the world has ever seen in economics. My friend and colleague Mervyn King described it as the nice years, non-inflationary, continuously expansionary. And this was partly due to much improved monetary policy regime with the combination of central bank independence and an inflation target, which during these years was almost exactly hit. But if we are to be honest, it wasn't that difficult to hit it, as represented by the fact that during these decades, interest rates were steadily trending downwards. So something else was happening. And indeed, after 2007, when the great financial crisis hit, during the period up to the COVID crisis, despite the massive expansionary forces, attempts by the central bank to expand, inflation remained stubbornly below the target rate. So something else was happening. A disinflationary force was affecting the world, and we ascribe that disinflationary force to the combined effects of globalization and demography, improved demographic trends. Let's turn to globalization first with the left-hand diagram. At the beginning of the period, Eastern Europe was in the 1980s. Eastern Europe was still under the Iron Curtain, and China was still behind the bamboo curtain. It hadn't joined the world economy. China represents a quarter of the world's population. And during the period up from 1980 to 2010, these two areas, Eastern Europe and China, particularly the latter, entered into the world's labor force. So the world's labor force effectively ceased just to be the blue line, but became the blue line together with the yellow line, which represented more than a doubling in the available labor force available to any employer who could switch their production of goods or services from the high wage economies of the West to the low wage economies in the East and in Asia. And that was a positive labor shock of an extent and a kind that has actually never been seen before. The result of that, combined with the improved demography, led to an increase year by year in the total of the working population that you see on the right. And again, as you can see from these charts very clearly, somewhere about 2010, these trends to magnify the availability and expansion of the working population available to any producer who could shift their production to where it was cheapest, rose and rose and rose. Meanwhile, the other major factor, well, let me just say why that globalization had such an effect disinflationary. And you were switching from high wage to low wage. That meant that the relative prices of those production, mostly goods, which could be shifted to the low wage economies, led to a relative decline in such good prices year after year after year. It also meant that the labor force in the high wage economies switched from those parts which could be more easily shifted, which were in general manufactured goods, to those parts which are less able to be shifted, which were personal services. And the provision of services is where the labor force is less well organized and has less bargaining power than it does on the factory floor with manufacturers. Let me turn also to the shift in dependency ratios. Can we have the next slide, please, Manoj? During these years, the number of young in the economy were falling fairly steadily. And before about 2010, the decline in the number of young outdistanced the increase in the number of retirees, because the decline in the birth rate to below the self-sustaining level occurred earlier and remained stronger at that stage than the increase in life expectancy. Now that had two effects. It increased the number of people of working age population. And because there were fewer children, and also women were having children much later in life, again, a trend that is not sufficiently recognized, there was a massive increase in women's participation in the labor force. So that the proportion in those of working age working in the labor force participating actually increased quite sharply. Then after about 2010, the situation changed because the number of young in the population remained relatively stable, while the increase in the old began to take off rapidly as life expectancy increased quite sharply year after year, while retirement ages were very sluggish in taking off. Now that meant that during the years up to 2010, there was a very considerable improvement in the dependency ratio. The proportion of dependents relative to population fell. Can we have the next slide, please, Manoj? Oh, okay, that had two effects. The first effect with the reduction in the number of dependents and the increase in the working population is that an increase in the working population by itself is actually disinflationary, both because you don't hire people unless the value of their product, the marginal value of their product, is higher than the wage you pay them. Moreover, if you're a worker, you know you've got to save to maintain your average standard of living over your life cycle when you retire. So an increase in working population is disinflationary, while an increase in the young and the old, particularly the old, who consume but do not produce, is inflationary. It has further inflationary effects because the old need people to take care of them, and the provision of support for the old is less well organized than the provision of schooling for the young. And the old generally get sicker, as you know full well if you've been watching the COVID results, where the average age of death is now about 82, about my age. And so we need much more medicine and medical support than the young. Now, turning to inequality, if you are worrying about world inequality, if you regard everybody in the world as absolutely equal, then you were faced with the fact that from about 1800, when virtually all of us were on subsistence terms, to about the year 2000, inequality worldwide increased because Europe and North America, north of the Rio Grande, and Australasia bounded ahead, whereas Asia and Africa remained in subsistence terms. Now, the shift of production from the high wage to the low wage economies led to a steady and in many cases really quite dramatic decline in world inequality. Look at the left-hand chart, where at the beginning of our period, the ratio of wages in the US to China was 35-1, and it has fallen by a factor of 7 to now just 5-1. And an equivalent but much smaller change in the ratio of Western European to Eastern European. So that worldwide inequality increased from 1800 to about 2000, and since then has begun to decrease quite sharply. Unfortunately, that was consistent with an increase in within country inequality, because naturally the people who were worst off were those whose jobs were relocated to China and Eastern Europe, and they were relatively the sort of the quartiles between sort of the lower, middle and lower quartiles of the income population, while at the same time those with capital, those with managerial, administrative ability, those who are higher educated, like most of those watching this particular presentation, their relative incomes have bounded ahead. Now, these trends, as I've said, are now about to reverse. So we're now going to have a situation in which the globalization is reversing for a number of factors. One is the increasing tensions between the US and China. The other is that the COVID epidemic in itself reinforced nationalism, and the dependency trends, as I've indicated, have been declining. Now, one of the effects of all this is that on present trends, the costs of medical support and pensions, old age care for the population mean that the projection for the deficit and debt well before COVID, because these figures are taken from 2018 from the UK, the Office of Budget Responsibility, show a continuing almost exponential rise in the public sector debt, public sector net debt as a proportion of GDP, and in a continuing increase in the deficit. And exactly the same is the case for the United States as well. This is the US again, prior to the COVID. This was taken in about 2018. And you can see the expectation under present policies of debt and deficit remain of this kind. I'd like just to make one very quick point. It's frequently said that we don't need to worry so much because after all, the debt ratios have been much higher than now after World War I and World War II, and in the UK after the Napoleonic Wars. And after all, we got away from that quite quickly. The problem with that is that wars were and were expected to be temporary. And during these earlier periods, it was and was expected to be the case that the primary surplus, the low public expenditures of the public sector, would lead to a reduction in the debt over time, as did indeed happen. What we have now is an expectation in peacetime that the deficits and debt ratios are going to rise very sharply and have jumped enormously as a result of coronavirus, with no reversal in sight, as was the case that there was a reversal in sight whenever we were fighting a war previously. So the situation is, in that sense, looking difficult. In another sense, it's looking difficult as well, which is that if you look at the rising debt ratios of the public sector and now increasingly of the private sector, again given a huge upwards jump by COVID, this has been offset almost entirely in terms of debt service ratios by the declining trend in interest rates, which I've already mentioned. So the debt service ratios, despite the very rapid increase in debt, have remained either constant or declining. Now, they've declined effectively about as close to zero as they're likely to get. And if we are right that the longer term trends in demography and globalization are going to reverse the previous disinflationary trends, then we're in some difficulties. Can we move on to the next slide? So how are we going to deal with the debt? One of the major problems of the present situation is that the nicest, most wonderful way of dealing with debt is to have a higher rate of growth. The problem with that is that growth is a function growth is a function of the combination of the growth in the working population and of the productivity of that working population. Here, the working population of the fastest growing parts of the world is actually going down and is going to grow less fast elsewhere, as in the US and the UK. A decline in the working age population will mean that growth will actually fall to the Japanese type levels unless we have a productivity miracle. Japan has actually done extremely well because what we've had is a decline of 1% per annum in its working population. At the same time, it's had growth of 1%, with the result that the growth per worker has been 2% per annum, higher than in virtually any other developed country. We will be doing extremely well if we can do as well as Japan. We do believe that productivity will increase from the rather dismal levels in our countries in recent decades, in part because in previous decades, corporates have been able to have massive great profitability by shifting production abroad, and so haven't had to raise productivity domestically in order to remain competitive, and indeed unit wage labor costs remain very low. If the reduction in the sort of huge surge in the labor supply continues, then and begins to lead to greater labor bargaining power, then in order to remain competitive, corporates will have to invest more at home domestically, and productivity should rise, but we think it's only going to be modest. Now, if we can't do it through growth, how are we going to deal with the debt? Well, you can raise taxes, but raising taxes is politically extremely unattractive. Nobody likes it, and nobody much votes for higher taxes, even if it falls on others, as we all hope that it will do one way or another. And indeed, for corporations, we think that what is likely to happen is that faced with their fragility, in many cases as a result of the COVID crisis, they will increase their markups. And that too will lead to more inflation. So if you were thinking of what will maximize the ability of the politicians to get re-elected, and they aren't able to raise growth very much, we think that rather than raising taxes, they will actually be quite happy with a somewhat higher level of inflation than we now have. Unattractive, but probably necessary as a way of keeping real interest rates down, and preventing central banks from, and they will prevent, and the politicians will put pressure on central banks not to raise short-term interest rates as inflation begins to rise. A result, an outcome, which the Fed, for example, at any rate in the first year or two after the COVID crisis, is actually welcoming in its averaging target that it has now adopted. Quite what will happen when that averaging has occurred and inflation remains higher than 2% is yet to be seen. This leads on to the question of what will the effect of the pandemic be? And here again, we have some very, very strongly differing viewpoints. One of the arguments is that the pandemic will cause continuing disruption and some great uncertainty, even when we get a vaccine, and a higher unemployment for quite a period of time, and that will hold inflation down a lot over future years. Against that, there has been a huge increase in monetary aggregates, particularly in the United States. The monetary growth of nearly 30% per annum, year on year, means that unless velocity remains extraordinarily low after the uncertainty and the forced saving has been relieved to some large extent by hopefully a vaccine, how we will deal with that monetary expansion remains to be seen. As I said earlier, we think that there are going to be increased markups. Quite a lot of the studies on the reason for low inflation has suggested that the Phillips curve has worked better for wages than it has for inflation because markups have been considerably reduced. There's no doubt the question of what's likely to happen in the next few years is arguable, but we think that there is a strong case for claiming that the pandemic itself will lead to the reversal of the previous demographic and globalization trends, having an effect on inflation rather earlier than we had previously thought likely. On we go. Next slide. Now, Manoj, at this time I turn to you to go through some of the countervailing arguments that have been presented to our viewpoint.
Thanks very much, Charles, Peter, and the Institute. Thank you very much for having us here. I'll keep my comments brief in the interest of time. One of the main things about this topic is we do tend to get a lot of disagreement on some of the drivers and some of the effects. Of course, markets disagree with us where interest rates are going to be over the next 10 years. But the substantive disagreements we've had over the demographic issue are broadly split into 5 categories. And I'll go through each of them very briefly, spending a little bit more time on the one that I have on the next slide, which is Japan, and finally pull up conclusions. The first one is Africa and India. In the first chart that Charles referred to, there was a little dashed line going up that some of you may have noticed, which was the working age population of Africa and India and some South American countries. So numerically speaking, these countries, this part of the world, will have an offset to the global headwinds that we are seeing, However, we don't think that they will matter economically for three reasons. First, it is very difficult, almost impossible in the current climate, to take labor from these economies and ship them to the advanced economies given the political scenario. Second, what that means is that the local demographies of the advanced economies are likely to suffer, and they, along with North Asia, are the largest contributors to global growth at the moment. It's very difficult to think that Africa and India are suddenly going to get into the driver's seat in large enough volumes of production to really balance off global growth from all the headwinds that Charles has spoken about. And finally, one of the particular problems of Africa and India is even though they've got the labor, their administrative capital and the historic absence of guilds and a workforce that has continually passed on historical knowledge means that their ability to behave in a single-minded fashion like China is very, very, very hard to visualize. For example, Africa has about the same population as India, but has around 50 states, which means 50 different national priorities and policies that need to be coordinated to even come close to a China-like existence. Second, well, why not then limit the benefits to the old? Some of this has already started happening. And in fact, the elderly have started responding to that. The participation of the elderly, which is a separate point, but can be amalgamated into this, has been rising for the last 20 years. And if you look at the pre-retirement cohort of around 55 to 64, that part of the demography in the advanced economies has shown a massive increase in participation. For example, in Germany, the participation of the 55 to 64-year-olds in 2003 was around 45%. And then came these German pension reforms. And at the end of a 10-year period, Germany's participation rate in that cohort rose to around 65%, which is at a global high. How much more can we squeeze out of that participation is a really difficult question to answer, but we suspect not too much. And so we come to technology, where we have two diverse viewpoints to point out. The first is, why not let artificial intelligence and robotics directly look after the elderly? Now, this is a point on which we do have a strong opinion, because both Charles and I have had a personal experience of dealing with old age and with dementia. And we can tell you very confidently that what the elderly need is exactly what machines can't provide, and that is empathy. So what we instead hope for is that technology, robotics, and AI will be very aggressive in getting rid of jobs in other repetitive tasks in the economy. We need that, and we depend on that, because over a period of time, what you're likely to see is a fairly large reallocation of labor into looking after the elderly. Now, that's what all of us would agree is socially productive, but not economically productive. And if you look at the working age population statistics that the UN population database pours out, that is frightening enough without accounting for an increasing part of the workforce being diverted to looking after the elderly. So if all our predictions are so dire, why haven't we seen inflation rise in Japan? Why haven't we seen this story play out in the part of the world that is leading the demographic reversal? Well, the answer is, in our mind, something that has been dealt with not as adequately by the part of the analysis that looks at Japan, mostly because that analysis has looked at Japan in autarky, or almost as if it's an autarky. So the simplest way to think about it, how could Japan inflate when its giant neighbor next door, China, was in the process of deflating the world? Japan had no way to stop the trends of disinflation and of falling interest rates at its borders, which meant that what happened in Japan has to be actually thought of as part of a global story. And there are three things here to keep in mind. One, Charles has already spoken about. Japan did see very, very, very good productivity growth, and we should be so lucky as to see anything close to that. The second point, which I think people are also familiar with, is that Japan's labor force is set in a very unique set of norms. And three things need to be kept in mind here. One, the labor force moved increasingly from manufacturing to services. Number two, it moved from full-time to part-time work. But number three, and something that Shirakawa-san has also made in his work, is that the adjustment in the labor force did not happen necessarily with employment, but with hours. So the hours of the working population on full-time contracts was reduced, and that's how the corporate sector dealt with it. But the key contribution that we have provided in the analysis on Japan is by looking at 20 years of data on offshoring from METI, one of Japan's key ministries. And that shows that, in great contrast to the general view of the Japanese corporate sector being under immense pressure of debt, Japan's corporate sector was actually incredibly dynamic. It understood that the rest of the world had a massive global supply shock to labor, and it used that supply shock to increasingly produce manufactured goods and services outside. Its employment in overseas investment increased dramatically, and so did the overall production. So Japan is not the blueprint that we should be using for looking at the future of demography, because it existed under a completely different global regime, which does not exist today. And just to wrap up, our conclusions. Well, first, inflation is coming. Before this coronavirus pandemic hit us, Charles and I were not really sure when that would happen. We thought it would be sometime over the next 3 to 5 years. But now, as Charles had said, we have increasing confidence that it will happen within a year or so after a vaccine normalizes life. Rather than the great financial crisis as the model where central banks pump money into the financial sector, what's happening today is central banks are financing fiscal policy, and those fiscal injections are going directly into the hands of households and corporates who will use that as an income boost when life normalizes. The effect will be that the yield curve will steepen because central banks will have almost no chance or willingness to raise interest rates in the near future. And that growth and inflation story will push nominal yields further up, further along the curve. The combination of the two will mean that asset returns, equity returns will be harder to extract, and that increase in within country inequality that Charles talked about earlier will start coming down. A few things will still have to be dealt with. The debt trap will have to be dealt with. How higher taxes are introduced is something that will have to be seen, and something to leave for Peter to take a bite at. Central bank independence, which has been almost an untouchable part of the institution, will come under increasing threat. As Charles suggested, the administrations will now have differing points of view from central bank because inflation is not falling, and their job will be to try and get re-elected, keeping growth intact and allowing inflation to rise. I'll stop there, Peter, and turn it back over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to both Charles and Manoj for this wonderful presentation. I'll ask the first question. I'll invite all of our attendees to start listing their questions in the Q&A so we can have a lively discussion and debate. It's often said that one of the hard parts about predicting the future is that it hasn't happened yet. And what I see in your model here is a number of different independent causes of this great demographic reversal. And if we were to put coefficients in front of each of them and then calculate their combined probability, it seems to me that the likelihood of the story unfolding exactly as you've described it is quite low because of the probabilities of each being far less than certain. And so part of my question, one of the big variables that doesn't seem to be a part of your model until the very end is the institutional reaction to these trends, not at the end point where you say, central banking, monetary policy decisions and fiscal policy decisions and healthcare decisions might occur, but indeed those that will be happening in phase 5 legislation in the United States, presumably sometime after this election. In other words, what happens as politicians, central bankers, and market participants, even if you're right about the near term, come alive to these questions and then start changing the policy landscape? In other words, just take the example that I would know best, which is the central banking one. Suppose that the early signals that the markets have not absorbed, that you have identified are correct. What happens with the average inflation targeting regime that the Federal Reserve just announced in August of this year? Does that mean that we will see a dramatic uptick in interest rates and the policy rate at at the Federal Reserve and other central banks? And if so, what will be the consequence over the medium term? In other words, is the story that you've told us a story that is relatively fixed and indifferent to what policy responses might be because of the deep structural issues that you're encountering? Or is this a policy outcome that could be shifted by fiscal and monetary policy makers in a variety of different fields?
Well, to begin with, demography cannot at any rate easily be shifted. And it's certainly the case that demographers have been as bad forecasters or even worse than economists. But given the birth rates that we've had over the last few decades, the availability of the working population over future decades is virtually certain. There is uncertainty about whether medicine may finally start to get a grip on the ills of the aged, which are mostly related to mental decay, Parkinson's, dementia. They may get better at doing arthritis. So it may be that we will all live much more healthily and can therefore participate. But so far, one's got to say that in the field of the illnesses of the old, there's been absolutely no luck at all. So that at any rate, you've got to, I think, assume that we won't get an improvement there, so that fiscal and monetary policy can do actually virtually nothing about the trends themselves. They're independent of fiscal and monetary policy. Now, we think that fiscal policy will focus primarily on trying to maintain growth and trying to maintain employment, because that's where the votes are, particularly perhaps the votes of the mass of ordinary workers who have been so badly affected in the developed economies by the shift of production to the low-wage areas. And what we think is going to happen is that the fiscal policy will effectively override monetary policy. The politicians will override the central bankers. In the short run, the central bankers, because of the undershoot that there's been recently, are perfectly happy with some recovery in inflation, which we think will happen. The question is, what will happen about 2 or 3 years down the road when the inflation rate has remained over the 2% target for a period of time and the average has come back to norm?
Charles, let me interrupt you just there, because we have a question from one of our attendees that gets right to this point, and let me see if I can get you to respond as you're saying this to this question. This is from our friend Don Cohn, who says, euphemistically, inflation wasn't so good for politicians in the 1970s. Why will it be easier for people to accept going forward? Is that because it's just better than the alternative, which is higher taxes? I would add to that question, which I think is where you're headed, there's a tension in your diagnosis here. On the one hand, you're seeing the opportunity for higher inflation that in some circles, including this one, is seen as an opportunity given the challenges that central banks have had in meeting their targets. But inflation remains in deep pockets of the polity just a third rail, a toxic element. Now, you mentioned this by saying that central bank independence will come under threat. But in your model then, is inflation good, bad, neutral? What's happening here from both a political and economic perspective?
Let us assume, for the time being, only for the time being, that we are right, that the underlying trends cease to be disinflationary and now become inflationary. The problem that we have now, that we did not have in the 1970s, is that the debt ratios are now vastly higher than they were in the 1970s, with the result that if the central banks start putting up interest rates in order to bring inflation back to the 2%, then that will drive us back into really quite a severe recession. I mean, there wasn't really time to put up the figures for the debt ratios of the non-financial private sector, corporate sector. But the debt ratios in the corporate sector have increased very, very sharply, particularly under COVID. And that means that if the central bank starts to put up interest rates, what we would then get, if that increase in interest rate was either significant or sharp, would be a major recession. And that major recession would do nobody any good because it would just reduce output and growth again. It might reduce inflation, but it would lead to a massive unhappiness and political disturbance. So we're in some ways in a worse position than in the 70s because of the huge increase in debt that we have allowed, and indeed the monetary policy low interest rate regime has encouraged to companies and indeed the public sector. And we haven't even begun to feel the adverse effect of that because debt service ratios have not gone up. When they start to go up, we're in trouble.
So one small thing I'd add over there is on your second question, Peter, is that some of the regime changes that you talk about policymakers working on, if they did embark on it already, yes, we do agree that our thesis would weaken, but from what we've seen over the last few years and certainly the last few decades, a lot of the tough questions that need to be answered on the question of pensions and healthcare benefits being taken away are not very easy to do. If you look at Greece, you look at Russia, you look at France, simple things like increases in retirement ages or taking away of benefits of the pensions have led to very severe political agitation and angst. The issue with a lot of these things is that the solutions that we think of from an economic point of view are often at very severe odds with the political benefits that can accrue from that, which means there aren't any. And the vote is what matters. As we've seen in the last few elections, the elderly increasingly come to the polls to protect what will be their benefit stream. And it seems very difficult to us to think that economic rationale can trump that.
Very interesting. So there's nothing policymakers can do about it, and it's going to be very bad. Is part of what I'm hearing from your two answers. Let me move to a different question.
Let me say that in many ways, I very much hope that I'm wrong, because the present situation is actually so dire that unless we can have very low interest rates and low inflation, we're going to be in trouble. And at the very least, you may say what we're saying is low probability. It's up to all of those around to decide their own probability distribution. But I think one of the things that we do feel very strongly is that it would be wrong to dismiss that what we are arguing is a reasonable, feasible, and coherent story that could happen. And if you don't think it's going to happen, you may be putting your head in the sand.
So let me get to a question from the wonderful Rosa Lastra, who writes as follows. As life expectancy improves, a further consequence of this demographic reversal, with important implications from the perspective of financial regulation and fiscal policy, is pension reform, in particular, a transition from PAYGO systems in many developed countries and from defined benefits to defined contributions. This is a key to avert old age poverty. Let me put the question to this comment, which is, what are the implications of your story about both the fiscal pressures, inflationary pressures, the political pressures, and these demographic trends for and being able to not only care for the ailing health of the elderly, but to ensure that they don't revert to an early 20th century model where age and poverty status become nearly perfect correlates.
So I'll jump in here on a few things. I think it harkens back to the last point I made, which is that this is broadly a story that has happened to a large extent. I don't have, again, for brevity, we didn't include some of the charts in here. But if you look at the participation rates of the 55 to 64-year-olds across the advanced economies, all of them have moved up quite significantly. And in most cases, the reason for that has been the move from defined benefits to defined contribution, or in some broad sense, a weakening of the benefits that the elderly were expected to receive. Now, we can argue, and it is indeed possible, as the question mentions, to significantly damage those benefits or reduce those benefits, in which case you would transfer the burden of that spending over from the public sector to the private sector, so that private sector savings ratios would go up, and keep interest rates lower for much longer. However, we come back to this political story, which is that if you damage the benefits to the elderly to a large extent, such a large extent that their own income stream in the present term comes under jeopardy, we don't think this is a politically feasible outcome. Not only have the elderly dealt on political grounds in past elections, but their numbers are only likely to grow from here. This is a constituency that will increasingly become a sensitive story. You just have to look at the average age of the two people running for election on the 3rd of November, where you're speaking from, to know that age is not something that we are going to leave behind anytime soon, as far as the political force is concerned.
Very good. I have a follow-up question to that, but we have a queue, and I want to continue to get our participants involved, our attendees. This is from Ted Truman, and then I think these questions are related. What does your model assume about the difference between R and G in the world of demographic tightening? For those who aren't familiar with this debate, the return on assets versus the rate of growth.
Well, our view is that unfortunately G will decline with the decline in working age population, or the decline in the growth of working age population. But we think that the margin between G and R will be maintained, because what we see is inflation rising, but the politicians are requiring willy-nilly the central banks to hold the short-term interest rate down, so that R will decline as inflation rises relative to the nominal interest rate. Now, one of the interesting questions is what's going to happen at the longer end of the yield curve. And it's conceivable that, that this situation will lead to yield curve control, but that will simply raise inflation even more and keeping R down. So we see both G and R going down, but the margin between the two not necessarily changing all that much.
Now, let me ask a follow-up on that. How could that be if inflation, which is going to primarily hit the holders of assets, is poised to increase so much? Why would the difference not decrease? I thought part of the implications of the book, at least.
Inflation rises more than nominal interest rates. That means that the real interest rates go down.
So
Charles is talking about policy rates, of course. In the longer end of the curve, if there is no yield curve control, it is possible that real interest rates could rise over there. But even that may be under some bit of pressure. If there is a move towards yield curve controls, you could get a very similar effect panning itself out. One quick thing to add is we do, as Charles and I have both suggested, we do see productivity rising, because some of the trends that have kept capital investment as a second best option will now change. So in order to protect their profitability, the corporate sector will move towards a little bit more capex. Satya Nadella has already said that some of the digitalization that would have happened over the next 2 years has happened in a couple of months over here. And the last thing to keep in mind is that we are quite optimistic for the difference between the rate of return and growth as far as emerging markets are concerned, because that's where a lot of the inefficiencies will be forced to be dealt with. And we could see some benign developments on asset returns in that part of the world.
Let me stay on this point of inequality, because in the book, I don't remember if you came to it in the presentation, but certainly in your book, that one of the implications of the great demographic reversal is not only the inter-country narrowing of inequality gaps, but intra-country narrowing as well. Number one, do I have that wrong? I thought that that's pretty clearly spelled out in your book. And if it is, what's the mechanism, given the fact that you just opened what you just described? About the
labor becomes short in supply. It's very simple. And also reshoring of certain crucial manufacturing production. And we saw in the coronavirus crisis that sort of critical equipment, PPE, for example, produced in one country, which had a contract to sell it to another country, even within the EU, those contracts were overridden by the authorities. And anyone who believes that when a vaccine is developed, that the country that develops that vaccine is not going to use it for their own nationals first, I think is living in cloud cuckoo land. The trends at the moment are for a reversal of globalization. That is going to reinforce the bargaining power of labor, which has been trashed. Private sector trades union membership has gone down. Admittedly, it will take time because for labor to recover its strength, but it will happen. I mean, the trends in the relative supply and demand. That's what we economists are here to worry about. And the supply of labor is going to fall relative to the demand because of these trends over future decades.
Peter, what we do argue in the book as far as emerging markets are concerned is a slowdown in the process of intercountry narrowing of inequality, because the large tailwinds that you got from globalization, as Charles very clearly pointed out, are no longer there to help them. And so the dramatic rate at which the US-China worker spread has gone down will now have to carry on some work with a little bit more inside the economy improvements. So part of the trade war issue is that China is now paying increasing attention to its own technological and chip making industries. That's the kind of work that they will have to depend on in the future. It won't be a global tailwind that lifts them all and brings them within touching distance of the advanced economies, as we had thought would happen over the last 30 years.
A question from Simon Gleason. Historic experience suggests that extended periods of high inflation and low growth lead to civil unrest and political turmoil, even though equality may be increasing, for example, the UK in the 1970s. What policy approach would you take in this scenario to minimize and avoid that? And I'm hopeful that you have an answer, because I'm trying to extract from you some sort of hope from the account that you're offering. That last part was my editorializing, by the way, not Simon's.
No, it's a horribly good question, and I don't have a great answer. I think what I would say to that is that this will, if we are right, become the key question in future years, future decades. And I hope that others will be able to produce the answer. We're simply producing an analysis that an answer to Simon's question, will become necessary.
But the usual tools that you might think would be available for managing periods of high inflation with low growth, lessons from the 70s, all of that, we feel like just don't offer the same opportunity for hope.
I think, again, things are made much more difficult by the debt trap. The fact that have such very high debt ratios. If it wasn't for the debt trap, we could do much more in the way of the Volcker reforms at the beginning of the 90s and of stable inflation.
You mean targeting monetary aggregates, a kind of disinflationary shock to the economy with all of its disruption?
If we have, I think it will become virtually impossible for central banks to reverse their expansionary policies at all quickly, irrespective of what happens to inflation over the next few years, unless inflation goes up to levels that are really, really worrying, by which I mean over 5%.
So one thing I'll add over here is much of the debate in financial markets, where a lot of the people I speak with is whether you can try and separate the two problems, which is that if you can have a relatively clean way without inflation of dealing with at least some of the debt, and there are significant problems, that these simplistic arguments don't really get involved in. And one of the stories over there is, can we have central banks who have bought an increasing amount of the debt issued by governments hang on to that and never have to get paid back for it? In other words, can we just forgive the debt with central banks? If that does indeed become the case, then it does allow a little bit more cyclical control to central banks to deal with the economies. But until those two problems coexist, I do think that the scope for maneuverability is limited. And the final thing to think about is, in the initial stages at least, it is possible that inflation is seen even by the broader public as the lesser of the two evils, which is something that even Japan throws up an example of. So Abenomics, when it was introduced, clearly came with a great contrast to the fixed income holdings of Japanese households, but they saw that as a way out of the long-term problem of debt that they have taken on upon themselves. How that plays out into the future is a really difficult story, and I'm with Charles here. I'm afraid we simply don't have very good solutions for that.
It does raise an interesting question, and I'll pose this as a question for you as our last one. Part of the implications of your account that you've identified is that there will be a threat to central bank independence. But given the account that you just identified, and given the fact that the policy tools to respond to the trends that you're identifying are not obvious, why should we even care about that? In other words, if central bank independence is going to cause central bankers who are going to view inflation as their primary policy enemy, and that they need political insulation in order to adjust it, the kinds of solutions that I would imagine for stagflation that you're expecting would be not a technocratic exercise, but a profound exercise in value judgment. Shouldn't we want central banks to be nowhere near the kinds of trade-offs that might be necessary to resolve the demographic trend that you're identifying? And if that's the case, what you're really saying an end to the institutional framework that evolved in the post-war era?
You may be right. I think that's a perfectly viable position to take. And I think these changes, if we're right, may cause a major change in the institutional setup.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And in fact, one of the only things that I would add is perhaps there is a little bit of inertia from central banks that would prevent them from taking this position early enough. If you look at how central banks have attributed a huge part of the disinflation of the last 30 years to themselves, I think they may still believe that they have a lot of control over this inflation going forward. If they're able to leave it behind, I completely agree with you and Charles that we would be in a much better place if central banks saw that the backdrop that they're operating their principles against had changed.
There's also one other factor, which is that the ECB is not a central bank where the institutional arrangements can be changed at all easily, because they've been set up by treaty. And I think that the problems of any institutional adjustment in Europe, in the EU, with the ECB are going to be far more difficult.
Well, Charles, Manoj, I have never been so thoroughly provoked by such a fascinating discussion that I hope and pray is nowhere near correct. Thank you so much for joining.
I rather agree. I hope that what we're saying doesn't come true. The only problem is it's perfectly feasible and coherent, and there are reasonable arguments for saying this is perfectly possibly coming down the road at us. So be aware.
All right, very good. Well, I hope and I want to thank you both. Thank again, Andrew, Alex, and Ashley from the Yale Program on Financial Stability. And thanks to all of our attendees who joined us during a time when there are many other things that are happening in the news cycle, but perhaps, as Charles and Manoj have taught us, none more important than what is looming in the short, medium, and long term. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.